Congress and to continue with this debate, what would be really very interesting, but I'm afraid it's hardly possible today. So, yes, indeed, Romanian framework of minority protection is really exemplary. Implementation is not always. We receive some complaints, but we are not going to discuss Romania with more details. So, Evelyn, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Actually, it's a pleasure to be finally invited by a leftist party, because usually I'm being invited to give speeches on minority rights or do trainings by the right, when minority rights is a social justice issue. So I'm really, really glad to be here now. Currently, I work for a research and educational institute, but before I used to work for Minority Rights Group International, so I would like to share more of my experience from the ground when it comes to minority rights, rather than going into theoretical discussions about minority rights. So when it comes to the first question, whether the minority rights framework is still instrumental and topical, obviously yes, the work is far from being done. Minorities are still not treated equally in Europe. You have exclusivist populism on the rise, both in Europe and outside of Europe. Indeed, minorities are being persecuted in some countries outside of Europe, triggering a refugee flow and migration flow that became both European and a global problem. So definitely, it is an issue that we have to deal with. Whether the current framework will be able to respond to all of those challenges, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that was it created to respond to these new challenges, and they haven't been able to respond to the old challenges either. And what I'm saying, obviously working with minorities, and what I see on the ground, that even those states that joined all of these European conventions and took up obligations to respect minority rights, usually what they do, they have excellent laws. Even sometimes you have laws that provide stronger minority protection that is required as a minimum standards by these conventions. But when you go on the ground, you realize there is a huge implementation issue. Usually, minorities are still being discriminated. Just to bring one minority that is not necessarily considered as a national minority, but definitely is considered an ethnic minority, and it's a European problem, is the Roma minority. If you just look at their case, obviously, it becomes clear that their rights are being violated on an everyday basis. So yes, a lot of things to do. How the system could be improved, obviously one thing would be having a much stronger monitoring mechanisms that minorities can turn to. I'm not sure whether redesigning the whole system now, I'm asking all of these questions, whether new minorities should be brought under the protection of these systems are necessarily useful. I know there is a lot of discussion going on, and that might seem traditional, but as a person who worked on the ground, I can see it's not even delivering what it should be delivering for national minorities. Also what we see, and I think I just mentioned, stagnation or even a regression. And I'm just thinking about Ukraine. Now, I didn't want to necessarily pick up a country, but what you can see there is actually a really weird way how the state is using the minimum standards to actually turn back to the old system. With the new education law in Ukraine, several of the minority languages are at great risk. Traditional minority schools that have been going on for years are being put in danger. They are no longer, they might not going to be able to function anymore. But still, Ukraine, except for the Russian minority, and it's a different question, but for other minorities, still would satisfy the minimum standards, even with the new education law. So you see, there was some progress, and now countries turning back and going back to the minimum standards. Whether the EU should be doing more about minority protection or promoting cultural diversity and equality, obviously, yes, it's one of the core values. It is in the EU Fundamental Charter, and basically acknowledged as a human right by the EU. And Usually human rights protection is left to the member states, but we also know that member states are failing most of the time when it comes to human rights implementation. So yes, it would be good if the EU itself would have a much stronger minority protection system and not to rely only on the Council of Europe system, which is, to begin with, a bit weak. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn, for some excellent points. Maybe a very brief comment. Minimum standards still do not exist in a vacuum. So minimum standards should coordinate with real possibilities and real demand. And of course, it much depends on what historically was established. So when minimum standards are achieved through diminishing standards which existed before, it's a different story in comparison with the situation when they are created anew. And we still have time for one very quick round of answers, just 1 minute. And the question is very simple. European Union is actually a union of minorities. There is no majority in the European Union. And we now have minority rights in the Charter. Do you think that European Union can do more in practice to defend cultural diversity and equality? Maybe now in the reverse order. Evelyn, please, your minute.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the EU could be funding more work related to cultural diversity. And I'm not only talking about cultural programs, but actually funding civil society grassroots organizations working on minority rights issues. Now, especially if you are part of if you are in a member state of the European Union, it's really hard to get funding unless you are doing a regional program. So it's kind of, the EU has this approach that the Copenhagen criteria tick, and then once you are in the club, it's assumed that minority rights are just great, which is not the case. So definitely within the member states, they could provide funding for civil society working on these issues. They could also, I think minority participation would be also really important when it comes to EU policies. So I know I keep using minorities, and you said there are no minorities in the majority vocabulary in the EU, but yeah, we still know what national minorities we are talking about, and we are still aware that there are national minorities within the member states. So yes, that would be my point, that specific programs focusing on protection of minorities would be really important.
Thank you, Evelyn. Serban, what's your view about the EU role?
You already mentioned that we can hardly say which are the minimum standards. This is probably the idea that European Union can set those minimum standards and principles that should be complied with all of the countries. You see, only 20 countries out of European Union ratified the Charter of Regional and Minority Languages.